Hi guys, hope you're doing well. This is going to be a prophecy update. I haven't done one in a little bit, but I think that we do them as we're kind of led to do them. It's not something I plan out on any kind of regular basis, but I do try to do it in a way that I see things happening, and as I think events, give a reason to have one, in the first place. But anyway, this one is it's going to be something like Satan's influence. The way I kind of jotted it down was Satan's influence increasing. A clear end time sign, and don't let that deceive you. There's definitely some things happening that I think it is definitely one of those key signs. I mean, Satan's influence has always been in the world for sure, but I definitely think there is definitely something that's changed and we're seeing a greater influence of Satan's work in the world. There's just no doubt about it when we see what's happening in the world, the drift towards more dictatorial control by what was previously free societies. We see that happening. We see a movement towards other things, which I'm going to get into. I'm going to try to touch as many verses as I can. I won't be able to touch everything, obviously. I may just glance over those things, so bear with me, but I will try to get everything in. There are some verses I definitely want to try to get in, and I guess we'll just jump right into it. Definitely ask for the Lord's guidance in this. It's not easy, so we'll do what we can. That's how it works. So there was what kind of led to this. I'll give you the story. So really what kind of led to this was I was and I've talked about this before. I'm a person who never has dreams, never, and if I do, typically they're just sporadic, weird, nothing to even think about, much less most of the time you can never even remember them. I can't. It's generally, I go to sleep and I wake up. I don't really remember dreams, and if I have any, it's not of anything important. But things weird about a year-ish ago, a little over that. So around there, I had a dream about, obviously, what I perceived to be the rapture or indication of rapture, and in it was just some very fascinating, powerful stuff. You can check that out for yourself if you want. But it was very, extremely powerful to me. But anyway, this one, and sometimes people shy away from that. I think you should always shy away if you start thinking about determining that determines your revelation. You're receiving this revelation of knowledge, and then you have to examine that against Scripture. But I don't think we should ever stop. And I was a little reluctant at first because it just was unnatural for me. It wasn't something I've normally done. But it says in the prophet Joel that in the end times God would give visions and dreams, and dreams told me and stuff like that. And I think that it is relevant that I'm not the only one experiencing those things; other people are as well. Well, anyway, one of those things that really kind of jumped out at me, and you take it for what it is. It's a dream, but very strange. And in it was just real short, simple, but powerful in the sense of image of like looking at a screen, and the word Satan came up. Just the word Satan. That was it, spelled out, and it was extremely powerful. And I woke up and said the word Satan. Wow. And I mean, just unusual for me to experience that, unusual for me to see something like that, much just wake up out of a dream and say that word. It's just very unusual. And so I had to think about that for a little while, and I was like, what was, because greater is he who's in you than he's in the world. Obviously, we can't be touched by Satan unless God allows it. And I don't think he was. I think it was a warning, and that's how I took that, and I still do. So I've been thinking about this over the last little period of time. I guess it's been a week or so. Anyway, so I was thinking about it, and what I come to the conclusion of was that, this time of Satan's greater influence in the world, a time in which we're leading into the end times, which I think we are. I think there's a number of things that are happening that validate, that improve that. And I'm going to try to give you some of that information in this prophecy update, which hopefully will bless you, help you in your understanding. And like Jesus said, be looking, be ready. So one of those things we should always be doing is in the Word of God. And part of the Bible, a huge part of it, is actually prophecy. So we should look at that. We should try to perceive it from the vantage point as God allows us within the scope and text itself, not outside of that. I think that's where you can get in real danger. And that's one thing, dreams can only sort of point you to what God has revealed, I believe. It doesn't necessarily give you any kind of new revelation, in my opinion. It can only, lead you to investigate what God has revealed, not what He hasn't. It doesn't mean that they're, that I will leave it at that. So, anyway, so one of those things I was thinking about, immediately started thinking about that was, if Satan is obviously, obviously that couldn't have happened without God allowing it to happen, And what was the message being relayed to me? And I think it's just that Satan's time and influence in this world has significantly increased in his power and his ability to act upon humanity and his authority to act upon humanity. Like we know, there are limitations. God limits him in what he can do and who he can do it to. Just like in the case of Job, he couldn't harm him without God giving approval. He can't do anything to us without God giving approval. He couldn't do anything to Peter without God giving approval. That's why, Jesus said that Satan had requested permission to sift Peter. He couldn't do it without God's approval. And the same goes for us. God, He can't do anything to any of us without God's approval and allowing it to happen. So, what was the reason for that dream? Well, to me, it seemed like it was in line with what came to my mind was Revelation 12. So we're kind of start there, and then I'll kind of jump into some things that I think it's alluding to because of everything that's taking place, and I'll try to get it all in if I can. So basically, I'm going to start with Revelation chapter 12, verse 13. It says, "And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman and gave birth to the male child." Right? So we know that Satan is obviously being cast down to the earth. And one of those things that kind of jumped out at me was that verse 9 in the same chapter when he says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, and the serpent of old, who was the serpent was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." And then it goes on to say that, "Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and authority of his Christ has come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night." And then it goes on to say in verse 12, it says, "For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell on woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he is only a short time." And in this he goes on to persecute, as we know, the woman being Israel, and the male child, obviously, he tries to persecute him, which would be Christ, foretelling of the coming of Jesus. Well, but the fact that he was thrown down to earth, at what point? He certainly had access to heaven for a period of time where he was accusing the saints, and then he gets to a certain point where he's cast down to earth. Was this something that was done at the time when Jesus talked about, "Well, I saw Satan fall," so forth, or was it something was he just foretelling something that was going to happen and it happened later? I don't know, but at the end of it doesn't say, so it would be purely speculation. But the point being is that if Satan has been relegated to earth, or is going to be relegated to earth, and as we start seeing the signs of the end of this age increasing exponentially, and I think we are, and that's some of the things I want to bring out, then certainly that we understand that maybe the case is this event has possibly happened. Obviously, there's not going to be a sign, per se in the stars, that, hey, Satan's been thrown down to you, woe to you, inhabitants of the earth. That's not the case. Instead, I think it's like this. It's potentially going to be given to Christians to warn people in the form of visions or dreams, or in the case of prophetic utterances, or whatever it is, and we're to be warning them. Well, I think that dream was a warning. That's how I took it. And I think it's a warning that Satan has been cast down, and that potentially, if that's the case, his influence is exponentially going to increase and is increasing in the world. And I think one great proof of that, people can say, oh, things have always been bad things have happened. It's true. That's absolutely true. Bad things do happen. But like I said, we always want to go back to the text. Otherwise you can make any dream become whatever you want it to be, and self-fulfilling in that case. But we don't want that. What we want to do is instead always go back to the text and see if things line up. That's how we test things. That's how we know, like Jesus said, be ready, be looking. Well, how are you going to be ready and looking? What are you comparing it to? Is it just a feeling, or is it a emotional, something you gather, you feel emotional about it and suddenly that's it? Or is it a warm fuzzy feeling in the stomach or something? What's going on? No, we are to compare it against his word, against his prophets, against what he's told us is going to happen, both old and new. And that, I think, is how we examine to see if somebody's prophetic utterance, or and I'm certainly not saying that's what mine is. I'm just simply saying it was a dream, or dreams or so forth. We can test those things and see it. And certainly, I don't know if it was. Maybe it was just a dream. It certainly could be that, but I definitely take it as a sense of that. To me, I took it as being a warning that potentially we're closing in on the time when Satan has been cast down and his influence in the world is exponentially increasing. His authority to act is exponentially increasing, which we know during the tribulation period it will. And that means leading up to the tribulation period, he will certainly have to have more influence and power in the world to bring about the things that are going to happen. The rise of the beast empire, the rise of the Antichrist, the events that are going to take place with the mark of the beast and so forth. All these things that will happen. He's certainly going to have to be an orchestrator behind it. The Gog-Magog war, the rise of the kings of the east. All these things are going to have to happen prior to or right at the beginning of the tribulation. I think prior to the tribulation for many of those things, certainly. When we start talking about the rise of the beast of the empire, which has to be on the scene, the 10 leaders, who gives their power and influence to the Antichrist, the preparation for the false prophet. These kind of things have to be in place, I think, prior to the tribulation. Okay, so we should be able to see things and test these things, and that's what I've been kind of bouncing around and thinking about over the last week or so. And one of those is just watching and seeing what's going on in the world. And one of those is certainly a rise. The return of Israel obviously goes without question. That's definitely one of the preeminent things. We see Israel back in its land. We don't see them having sovereign authority over Judea and Samaria, though. That is one thing that is a telltale sign. I did some videos on it, a couple of them. I still think that's one of the key signs that we should be looking for. And remember, I believe that Satan does not want the end times to come. He's not looking for. He realizes that there's no way he's going to beat God. He's not stupid. He's a very intelligent being. He doesn't want to be locked away for 1,000 years. He doesn't want to be at the end of that, to be thrown into the lake of fire. He knows Scripture, and he knows his end result's going to be. And to him, I think it's a win if he can put it off for as long as he possibly can. And that's why he wants to kill the Jewish people. That's why he wants to destroy them, because obviously if Israel's not back in its land, then obviously the Christ's return and many of the prophecies that lead up to that, including the Gog-Magog war, Israel has to be back in its land, the restoration of Judea and Jerusalem from Joel 3. All these things have to be fulfilled. If he can stop that, God's word can't be fulfilled until it happens. So he wants to try to prolong it for as long as he can. Just like a person who's a thief, he tries to put it off as long as he can, or criminal, as long as he can before he has to go before the court and be thrown into prison. He doesn't voluntarily want to go there and get thrown into prison. He goes when he absolutely has to, because he doesn't want to go to prison. And I think Satan's the same way. He doesn't want to be thrown away into the outer darkness and locked away in the abyss for 1,000 years, and then eventually come out and, after testing people, thrown into a lake of fire for eternity. That's not something that I'm sure he wants to do. So I think he's trying to push it off as long as he can. Obviously, Satan doesn't want the end times. But that's why when this whole ideal about the annexation of Judea and Samaria and the acknowledgement of the sovereign authority of the Jewish people over Jerusalem, was, I believe, the restoration of Jerusalem. The first part of Joel 3, 1 and 2's prophecy. The restoration of Judea was starting to be discussed, and the whole world exploded. The rise of COVID exploded. If you go back and look, exactly at that time when they were talking about the annexation of Judea, and I did some videos on that, suddenly COVID exploded, come out of China, out of the kings of the East, and the insanity pursued from that point on, the lockdowns, to everything else that's going on. All of that was happening at exactly that point in time when they were talking about the annexation of Judea. He does not want that. It's going to happen because God's ultimately in sovereign control. It will happen again. And when it does, when it talks about it, and when it does take place, it will be a division of the land, just like it says, but ultimately they'll have sovereign authority. And we'll touch on Joel 3. I think it's very important. But one of the things I want to talk about is kings of the East. Rise of the kings of the East is extremely important because it's one of those things that you really can't, make up, or, I mean, it's either it has or it hasn't. I believe China and India perfectly fulfill that. They work together. They train. Militaries even train together sometimes. They're also hostile to one another, and at times enemies. They fought wars. But I think at the end of the day, especially as we get into closer to the tribulation period and in the tribulation period, they will see mutual benefit in being loose alliance or close allies even, than being hostile to each other. And I think that as materials and supplies continue to become harder to get, just like it talks about as being, that's another prophecy we're starting to see all these supply chains being affected. That's another thing. And when China and India see the advantage of working together, trading together, training together, and merging many other economies and so forth together, I think that will become a reason for them to come together, because it is plural, which we're going to see. So it's interesting. So we'll look at Revelation chapter 9. We're going to look at verses 13 through 19 real quick. I'll read it real quick, and then we'll jump to Revelation 16:12, which I think is the fulfillment of it. So we're looking at the trumpet, the sixth trumpet's being blown by the angel, and it says, then in verse 13, then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, one saying to the sixth angel, who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound in the great river Euphrates. I believe these are fallen angels that are reserved for that period of time. They're so powerful and demented on the destruction that they are bound for that period of time. But notice that they're in the east, beyond the great river Euphrates. They're the ones who are influencing China. Now, why do you think China, Vietnam, these kind of places are all communist countries, hostile to God, atheistic in nature? Look at what they do to Christians, persecution of Christians, so forth. Exactly what we would expect to see. And I think their influence in that region of the world, just like there's the fallen angel that was opposing Daniel, who was over Persia. And notice that Persia is completely, by and large, Christianity is going there, and people are turning to Christ right now. But notice the influence overall is pretty much hostile to Christianity and to Christ to this day. So he goes on, it says, and the four angels who had been prepared for this hour and this day and this month and this year were released so that they would kill a third of mankind. So ultimately, a third of mankind is going to be killed by the kings of this east at this period of time. We know it's going to be late in the tribulation period, or later in the tribulation period, like again, 6 trumpets being blown. The number of the armies of the horsemen were 200 million. And it goes on to say a little bit more, and I'll read verse 18. And it says, I heard a third of mankind was killed by these plagues, by fire, smoke, brimstone, war, potentially nuclear war, but certainly war, which proceeded out of their mouth, for the power of their horses is in their mouth, their tails, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on to just talk about this and it's like, okay, well, who are this group can raise a 200 million man army beyond the Euphrates River? Well, I believe that's certainly in fitting with the kings of the East. And we see that in Revelation chapter 16. And in Revelation 16, verse 12, it says, the sixth angel, and this is the sixth bowl. So that was the sixth trumpet. This is the sixth bowl. But it says the sixth angel poured out on his bowl in the great river Euphrates. Again, referring to the same river, the same area, same region. And its water was dried up so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. And notice again, this is an army that's coming from that direction. It's all within the same time frame or a short period of time. So I think these very well correspond with one another, and that this 200 million man army is going to come marching down through this dried up river of Euphrates, and they will ultimately wind up killing 1/3 of mankind through methods of war, be it nuclear or not. And I think when it says these kings, and notice it uses the plural, kings from the east, I believe that will be most likely going to be, again, India and China merge. It definitely is going to be China for sure, I believe. And they're going to have this 200 million army. And isn't it interesting that China right now is emerging as this great power that's threatening everybody, and suddenly everybody's waking up to that problem militarily and everything else. They just recently tested this hypersonic missile that went all the way around the whole planet, and then came down and supposedly hit its target within certain distance of miles, that, whatever it was. But if it was nuclear, I mean, I guess a few miles isn't going to make a difference, So anyway, the fact that it did it really sent shockwaves supposedly throughout Pentagon, which shows you how out of touch they are, because anybody else could look at it and go, China's certainly bent on building a major military and navy. I mean, they've launched aircraft carriers, just all kinds of ships. They said that they outnumber American ships. I mean, what does it take for someone to wake up? Well, apparently when you're deceived, I guess it goes a long way. And certainly Americans' leadership is definitely deceived, and many in the West were too. But there are some interesting things afoot to combat that Chinese influence. And one of those that was announced was the coalition of Australia, America, and the UK. And I thought that was a very fascinating one. It really sent a strong message to China, and they were pretty upset about it. But the point being is, like, okay, we're seeing things happening. We're seeing alliances forming. We're seeing the kings of the East obviously rising in power and influence throughout the world to the point, I mean, look at anything you buy and it's pretty much stamped onto China. Well, all that money and stuff that we're buying, all this stuff is all coming over there. All these, these supply chain issues that we're having is because we get so much stuff from over there. And they're purposely, I think, could be wrong, but I purposely think they're trying to destroy the American economy, push us over the edge by shutting down one of their major shipping docks. It was where ports where everything goes through and out. One of those was shut down, which really, greatly limited how much is actually being, shipped at that point. And then not to mention the stuff, how we're unloading stuff, the whole aspect of COVID. Very fascinating. I don't think anybody can argue or dispute the fact that China is emerging as this massive power. At the same time, you have, India emerging economically and also militarily. They're starting to increase. Still not obviously at the level of China for sure, but they certainly are growing, and they have a massive population. Between the two of them, we're looking at about 3 billion people. Almost, not quite half the planet's population, but certainly not far off. And when you start talking about 200 million man army, those two combined could certainly raise a 200 million man army fairly easily. So we need to keep that in mind, that just because they're hostile today in some ways doesn't mean that they won't be allies in the future. At the same time we see that, now we'll kind of shift over to what I see as Russia's influence. Naftali Bennett, of the Prime Minister of Israel, has reportedly said that he acknowledged that Russia was, the northern neighbor of Israel. That was important. That's an important statement. He acknowledges that is the neighbor to the north, and the fact that a lot of people say, well, it could, when you're talking about Gog-Magog and that kind of stuff, it could be anybody. Well, obviously, if you read through it, it's clearly, Russia, the furthest one north, but also other people will come into play. One of those would be Gomar and Beth Togarmah, which is most people believe to be Turkey, which is also north. And then you look at Persia, modern day Iran, and there's some other nations named, but those three, they're in league together. They're situated in Syria, on north of Israel, on the mountains of Israel. There's instability in Lebanon. Hezbollah is certainly having issues. These things are real and happening, and Iran is instigating a lot of this negative contention. right on the border, right on the north of Israel. Israel is having to defend itself and have regular weekly, if not nightly, air raids and attacks and bombings on elements in Syria. And that's causing friction with Russia, who's in essence signed on as the protectorate, is exactly what Ezekiel 38 talks about when it says that it would be the guard, and what is a guard but a protectorate? It becomes the protectorate for Syria and the government of Syria, and also for Iran, who's there, the troops that are there, and also for an agreement, as it were, for Turkey in a lot of ways, but Turkey obviously being its own powerful nation, is still somewhat hostile and still not fully committed to Russia. And that's exactly the scenario we would see with the Gog-Magog alliance, because it says they seem to have no trust for each other, so that when God sends this great earthquake, and he also sends a great sword against them, which I think could wind up being America, that at the same time, that distrust will make them cause each other to turn on each other. And if they were really close allies, I don't think you would see that. But the fact that one's NATO, one's not, they don't necessarily truly trust each other. Remember that Turkey shot down a Russian jet not that long ago, and just things like that. So you don't. There's not necessarily great trust there. They fought, I think, I want to say it's around 9 or 12 wars, something like that, between each other. So there's definitely a history that goes there of distrust. And so with this great earthquake, the confusion starts, and you could clearly see, also with them being attacked, you could clearly see where they would turn on each other and wind up killing each other, helping kill each other, as this great sword that is talked about in Ezekiel 38 is brought to bear against them, which I think could be the United States. When you start thinking about those nations and where the United States sits at, it could happen. Can't say for sure, but I think that it certainly could happen, and I think that might be the sword that's talked about. It could be just Israel, but I think it's probably America as well, that will bring its sword to bear against those nations. And we'll see ultimately at the end of the day what will happen. Joel kind of alludes to this and talks about, I think this is what he's talking about in Joel chapter 2 and verse 20. He says, "But I will remove the northern army from far from you, and I will drive it into the parched and desolate land, and its vanguard into the eastern sea, and its rear guard into the western sea, and its stench will arise, and its foul smell will come up, for it has done great things." Again, I think this is alluding to that Ezekiel 38 and 39 war that's going to take place, and at the end of the day, it's going to be repelled, pushed back, and destroyed. And I think it's going to happen prior to the tribulation, and I think it's not that far off, actually. So keep your eye on the attacks and the things about what's going on with Israel, Russia, Iran, Turkey, in Syria right now. I think we're seeing the foundation for the Gog-Magog war, and if that's the case, we will most likely see something happen sooner than later. So definitely want to keep an eye on that. Things are moving very quickly, and I think as we start to see that, events are going to come to a conclusion there, which means, as well, again, like I talked about Joel 3, 1 and 2 is a great prophecy that talks about the restoration and the fortunes of Judea and Jerusalem. When that happens, I believe the restoration of Jerusalem has already happened. The United States acknowledged, and other countries have acknowledged, Israel's sovereign authority and control over Jerusalem, but they haven't acknowledged their annexation of Judea yet. It does say, as you read down through that, they have divided and scattered my land, but it goes on to say that it would divide the land. And it says, "I will gather all the nations, bring them down to the valley of judgment, when they enter into judgment with them on behalf of my people, inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and have divided up my land." Notice that it's his. And so I think there's a clear sign that what we should be looking for when we see the annexation of Judea, and part of that agreement, that 7-year agreement, and right now they're talking about this Abraham peace accords, perfectly fits in line with this whole ideal or premise of a peace agreement ultimately coming out that will be 7 years in duration, maybe a trial period. Hey, we're going to try out a 7-year peace agreement, and people will sign on to it, these nations, and that will be the beginning of the 7-year tribulation period, and ultimately the one who confirms that agreement, will be the Antichrist. So I believe he's probably alive and well, involved in politics, involved in this peace agreement. Right now, my personal opinion, could well be Jared Kushner. I'm not saying he is the Antichrist, but I'm saying he very well could be. I don't know, but just something we need to keep an eye on. But if things continue along that path, we certainly need to be aware of that. He's heading up a thing about Institute for Peace based upon the Abrahamic Peace Accords, which he's heading up. Keep that in mind, and especially if we get into some changes in America, changes in our alliances, and how this final alliance will be configured. I think when the Beast Empire emerges, probably through some economic demise of the dollar, that it will ultimately usher in the mark of the beast, which I think with this whole global pandemic thing that's happening with COVID and so forth, people having to get the vaccine stuff, I think, not that I don't believe that's the mark of the beast by any means, stretch your imagination, but I think it's alluding to at least the establishment of how governments are going to force and coerce people to eventually take a mark of the beast, just like they're doing right now with having to have this passport stuff. It's just setting a foundation, a precedent, that could be used. Anyway, I hope this is a blessing to you. Keep looking up. I believe the end is really near, and I believe Jesus Christ is coming back for his church very soon. God bless you. Be safe. We'll see you.